Hi everyone, this is Mary Michon at Bensell Greenhouse in Toledo, Ohio, and today we're going to talk about basic orchid care. So I brought my orchids from my house, which I have collected either from the greenhouse here or, like many of you, I've kind of saved or rescued a few from box stores. I'm always experimenting with plants, and orchids have always been a little bit more difficult for me. I'm heavy water, and I know a lot of people will be attending many of the Midwest orchid shows. Some of them have already finished in January, but there are still many going on through March. And we thought this was a perfect time if you were purchasing orchids from these shows or even getting them from different areas. I want to give you just some basic care. We're not going to get into in-depth for every style and every variety of orchid. It would take us hours. And so really what I'm going to do is take a look at one of the most common orchids, the Phalaenopsis or moth orchid, and also talk about another one that I've had at my house called an Oncidium. And we'll talk a little bit in between about some of the different other varieties, some of our hybrids and things like that. But we're just going to talk about basic care. I'm not going to get in depth to any one species. Okay, so I've brought a few of the orchids that I have at my house into the greenhouse because over the weekend I noticed there were some things going on. So I have 3 Phalaenopsises and an Oncidium orchid, and we're going to work on these a little bit. But the first thing I want to talk about overall for all of your orchids is lighting. Whether you have a moth orchid, a Phalaenopsis, you have an Oncidium, there are Dendrobiums, there's Cattleyas, there's Brassias, there's Miltonias. There's all different varieties that you may be seeing out there, and lighting is really, really critical. So doesn't matter what variety of orchid that you have, lighting, think about where orchids typically grow. And if you're really interested in knowing where these orchids originate for, you can look that up online and find out that many of your orchids are going to grow on trees, on branches, in the crooks of trees, and therefore they get dappled lighting. So eastern exposure in the Midwest is really ideal for most of your orchids. If you have a southern or western window during the summer months, if you're keeping them indoors, that's direct sunlight in my eyes, and that's too harsh on them. So you want to put them behind maybe a sheer curtain, or I would say keep them away from southern and western light and get them somewhere where they get a little bit less than direct sunlight. You don't want direct sunlight on orchids at all. So one of the things that you can see in my orchids is there is some fading on this Phalaenopsis down here in this area, and that just tells me that this plant, I opened my shades of my sheer curtains. This has been exposed, and we're getting more sunlight now, and we're getting longer daylight hours. So I can already tell that I need to move or close those sheer curtains so this Phalaenopsis is not getting too much light. Same thing with this one. This one is showing signs of some chill. I have a very old house and cool windows, and I think this was set too close to a window. So this color change that you are seeing here is from a colder window, and it will remedy no problem because I will remove it and put it in the right location. So overall, most of your orchids are going to require dappled lighting, no direct sun whatsoever. And you want to think about the difference in lighting between winter and summer. So summer is very intense, very long, drawn out days, and winter not so much. So sometimes you need to move your orchids around so they get the proper lighting. If you look at these Phalaenopsises, this guy, although smaller, this is the right color. You want a nice solid green. It should not be super dark. If it's really, really dark, that tells me it's not getting enough light. And again, this has a little bit of a red tone to it. This tells me that it's getting a little bit cooler. This was up against a cool window. And then this guy, like I said, this one is fading in color. So this one also, this is too much light. This is the perfect color of leaf for a Phalaenopsis. You will see similar things in leaves of other types of orchids that you may have. Okay. So one of the things, like I said, is as I was watering my plants this weekend, I noticed that there were some subtle changes in the plant, and you as a plant owner, as you are moving throughout your home, looking at your different plants, watering and fertilizing, you too will realize that leaf color is different, tips might be a little bit brown. So that's the time for you to pull it off the shelf, pull it off of its hanging area, bring it back down, and take a really good look at what's going on with your plant. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about temperatures, because that also, for most of your orchids, will be within about 10 to 15 degrees. Your Phalaenopsises love it really, really warm. It's going to be difficult for somebody in the house in the Midwest to keep it at a temperature that it loves, and to have a differential in temperature, which most orchids prefer. So growing out in nature, they have warmed, humid summer days and cooler evening. And that just can't happen in our home unless you are adding humidity, adding some different types of medium and things like that. So temperatures for your Phalaenopsises, they love 80 degrees by day and about 65, 70 at night. So you have to do your best with that one when you have a Phalaenopsis in your house. And given I've had these for years, they do acclimate well. Your Oncidiums, they like it a little bit cooler, so they like it in the middle 70s, maybe reaching 80s, and a little bit cooler in the evening. Same with some of your other types of orchids. So those are things, if you have some different varieties, please look up what their temperature needs are and try to emulate that as best you can. In the house in the Midwest, it can be a little difficult to get the temperatures perfect. One of the things that you can do that is really enjoyable for all of your orchids is in the Midwest, we have such warm, humid summers. Get them outdoors if you can. People are worried about bugs, and that's not something I would worry about when they love that humidity. Get them out, hang them in the trees under dappled lighting, and let them enjoy the cool air, the rainwater, and the wind blowing through them under dappled lighting, no direct sun again. So temperatures is also crucial, but as I said, most of your orchids in the Midwest will adapt well to different changes in temperature because we cannot provide in our house 80 degrees and high humidity. So do your best. The next thing that we want to talk about, let's also talk about humidity, because orchids love humidity. And as they are growing in nature in the crooks of trees, if they are in the Florida area, they get a lot of humid summers, a lot of different types. And so we can't always do that unless you have humidifiers around your plants. But even so, you cannot create humidity of 65 to 85% around your orchids unless you have them encased in some sort of area and you have humidifiers around them. And humidifying too much in your house is not always a healthy thing. So one of the ways that I promote humidity around my plants is to actually fill a pebble tray with water and set my orchid on top of it and watch the water level in this tray. As the water evaporates around the orchid, it adds extra humidity around it for them to enjoy. That's one way to do it. The other way, of course, is proper watering. So humidity, of course, is very, very important, especially in the Midwest. As our temperatures dip and we lose humidity in our home, you have to think about that and maybe provide more humidity around your orchids. They really do enjoy it, and it's not that hard for you to do. So a little trays of pebbles, maybe bowls of water sitting around, and let that humidity move in and around your orchids. They will love it. So let's talk now about watering. Watering, again, I think lighting is probably the #1 issue with orchids, but watering is probably the second, very close to the first as well. And so in the past, I used to have orchids and I watered them weekly, just like a house plant. That's not what you need to do. And so what you want to think about is the type of medium that they come in. Many of your orchids, when you purchase them, are in things such as charcoal, lava stone, pumice, orchid bark, which can be Douglas fir bark or a pine bark, or let's see, we have a different type of pumice here, or even long fiber sphagnum mosses. So I like to keep my orchids when I purchase them in a very similar medium that they started in. That is what they are accustomed to. When you start switching it out so much, sometimes they go into a bit of shock. So I have a number of different Phalaenopsises, and a couple of them are in bark, and one of them is only in long fiber sphagnum. So we're going to kind of go through those. Think about watering depending upon the type of medium that you have. So if you have an orchid bark and you water it, the water just washes across the orchid bark. It may take some in and it may keep it a little bit on the moist side, but it's going to drain very quickly, especially if it is bark, stone, pumice, charcoal. When you have long fiber sphagnum and that is watered completely, it will be a little bit soggy. You want to be very careful that you are not taking it so that it's just soaking soggy wet. There has to be breathability in your pots. And so if you have a lot of long fiber sphagnum and you keep it in a container that doesn't have proper drainage, it's going to get very moist and the root systems on your orchids will begin to rot and you'll start seeing signs that the plant is not doing well. Watering is also dependent upon the type of container that you're putting it in. You consider the medium first and foremost, and then think about the container that you have. So I have this Phalaenopsis. It is strictly in long fiber sphagnum, and it is in a glazed pot that has no drainage, and it has no slits for airflow on the side. So I believe that that is going to cause a problem with this orchid down the road. So eventually I'm going to get it out of there and take a look at it and see. So if you have a container that doesn't have drainage, that will be very problematic unless you are super specific about how much, what quantity you are watering. So here at the greenhouse, we carry glazed decorative orchid pots, all different colors, as well as clay, okay? And the difference between those and what you might see at a box store is our orchid pots typically have a lot of openings on the side of them for good airflow, which is really important. So think about this orchid as it's up in the crook of a tree and the roots are grabbing a hold of it. There's a lot of air movement across the roots, through the leaves, on the flower stems. And when you start to put it into a pot that doesn't have all that, that's when that root system starts to get a little funky. They rot a little bit. So look for pots that have a lot of holes on the side of them. And this one has never gone, I have never taken this one out of the container that it came in when I bought it at the store. And it has drainage holes on the bottom, but it doesn't have any air holes on the side. That tells me, although it looks really good and it is starting to bloom, I'm going to wait. It tells me that I need to get it out of this pot and look for plastic clear pots, which are really nice for people to see, and make sure that they have holes in them. The problem is, because the roots on orchids photosynthesize, they also like a little bit of light. So if you have a pot like this that doesn't have holes in it and you drop it into a glazed decorative pot, or sometimes they come in plastic pots that don't have any light exposure to them, now sometimes you'll have some issues with the roots as well. So this guy was at my house sitting down into a decorative pot that didn't have holes on it. I'm bringing it in. Now I'm going to transfer it into something that has some holes to give it more breathing space. So what I would say with everyone when you are buying your orchids, take a look at the pots that they're in. Make sure that there is holes in there. You can cut slits in these plastic. This guy is pretty old, so he's breaking down. It's time to repot him as well. The last thing I want to talk about for basic orchid care is fertilizing. I think a lot of people forget to fertilize their orchids. And remember, as they're growing in nature, they're getting a lot of organic matter. Wind is blowing, different spores, things rain, they get rainwater, things are shedding from the trees. They're grabbing a hold of the organic matter within the bark. And we just don't have that in our home unless you've got it on some sort of slab. But even at that point, the movement isn't the same. So one of the things about fertilizing, and basic fertilizing is very simple for orchids. What I would say is fertilize with something. There's a lot of specific rules that I'm not going to go into in this type of video for all the different orchids. If you are becoming an orchid collector and really want to push your orchids, then I would say get a beautiful orchid book, start reading more about them, and fertilize very specifically. As a general rule, orchids really need to be fertilized weekly and weekly. So weekly, every week they should be fertilized, but not at full strength. So I like to fertilize a quarter or a half strength for a few months out of the year. So what I look at in my orchids, the variety that I have and when they typically bloom. Phalaenopsis or moth orchids are usually cool weather winter blooming. So they tend to start spiking out with flowers sometime in December all the way through March during our winter months. And I usually start fertilizing my orchids, my moth orchids or Phalaenopsis orchids, later in the fall. And I continue to fertilize them through their flowering spike. So oftentimes it ends up to be almost 6 months of fertilizing, and then I give them a nice washing, a few months of no fertilizer, and then I start picking it back up again. When you fertilize it that way, when you start off fertilizing them and then you give them a couple months of no fertilizing, when you do that again, then it starts to jazz them up and they realize that things are different, and they oftentimes can produce more flower spikes and are a healthier plant. So most orchids prefer a higher nitrogen fertilizer. That's your first number. You have nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. So a lot of orchids like the first number to be higher. That's what produces big, nice leaves that support all of the flower growth. But a well-balanced fertilizer, especially for your Phalaenopsis, is ideal. So a 10-10-10, 20-20-20, especially if you've never fertilized, just a nice balanced fertilizer is really, really nice. And do it often, but do it weekly, like WEAK, week, not full strength. So fertilizing is really, really important. And that's what helps support all of your flower buds. So if you've never fertilized before, you may have issues with blooming. The other thing to consider is if you are that person that has done really well with the Just Add ice cubes, then you may want to make ice cube fertilizers so that that continues. A lot of people bring their orchids in here and they look very, very healthy. They've just never bloomed before because they've never fertilized them. So that would be one way. Just make sure that your fertilizer in your ice cube tray is put away somewhere so people don't take it out and think they're drinking blue Kool-Aid. So be careful with that. But if you are happy with the way you water with ice cubes, make fertilizer ice cubes and use that when you are watering. I'm not always a big fan on ice cubes because when you do water your orchids, they don't really like cold water. They like tepid water. They like warm water. And so ice cube watering is really meant for people who do a lot of overwatering. I would just recommend try to figure out what amounts of water your orchids need every week or every few weeks and use that instead of ice cubes. The other thing that ice cubes may do for your, especially your Phalaenopsis, is if you are watering with ice cubes, sometimes it does give them a little bit of a cooling temperature that you may never have given them if you've not taken your plants outside. So sometimes that does help a little bit with cooling them off in the house that's always been the same temperature. That's my theory. It's not really proven, but that could also be part of why orchids with ice cubes tend to do okay. So the last thing we'll talk about is I want to just show you a couple little things on my orchids to show you where I might have gone wrong or where you might be going wrong, and a couple things just to fix. Very quick tips on orchid care. So I'm just going to clean this guy up and I'm going to talk as I do that, just so you know. I haven't worked on this orchid for almost a year and there's a lot of brown roots on it. So I'm going to make sure I get in here and trim away some of the dead roots. I typically do not take my stem off. You can see that this is an older bloom. I usually never take my blooms off or the stems off until they turn brown, which is right here you can see, and I go down at the base. This guy is clipped on. And I take the stems off there. And then I kind of look at all my root systems and take away anything that might be dead or browning, okay? This is just showing me there's some moisture in this pot, so I can tell that I'm, doing okay with watering, but the airflow through the root system this is pretty compact in here. So I want to make sure I'm going to break this up, and I'm going to repot it into a pot here, and I'm going to add a little bit more like pumice stone, something that's going to break it up and give it a better airflow. Get it out of this pot that has no drainage in it and it's just too compact. The other thing to look at is these flower spikes. So this guy here, Because I have not taken this stem off, look at, there's 2 flower spikes coming here. I'm really only going to take this off. I'm going to go down, take that guy off, trim away the brown. Okay. And you want to trim away any dead leaves that are on the bottom. I'm just going to take this guy out, shake off all this bark, and look at my root system again. I want to make sure that these roots are nice and thick and heavy. And anything brown I will trim away. And there's one leaf in here that's normal for a leaf to kind of turn and go brown. But I just want to make sure I'm cleaning it up. And then this guy, even though he's blooming, I'm not manipulating this a whole lot. This guy I'm going to set in here, and I'll add a good growing medium to that one, and you are good to go. Think about repotting your plants, checking them out maybe once a year, and then you're fine. So hopefully this helps. If you are out for a first-time orchid purchaser, just think about lighting, watering, humidity, and fertilizer. Good luck, everyone.